Welcome to another episode of The Modern Hotelier. In this episode, we're going to release our conversation with Mark Keiser, President of Development at Viceroy Hotels. David, what was your favorite takeaways from this conversation?
Well, it was really interesting listening to his background, going from kind of making it into operations with not really having operations background, and then getting into the development side, and then also just learning about the Viceroy, kind of their culture, their vision for the brand, and learning about some of their new destinations that possibly are coming up. So it's a great brand, and it was a great talk with Mark.
I agree. Being a fan of Viceroy and of Mark, we've got to meet him a handful of times. I was really excited for this conversation, and it didn't disappoint. It was so fun to hear what he looks for when he's developing new Viceroy properties, and his background as well was pretty great. So excited to hear what y'all think. Let us know in the comments.
Enjoy it. Welcome to The Modern Hotelier, the most engaged podcast in hospitality. Don't forget to follow, like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what you think about today's episode. Steve, who do we have on the program today?
Yeah, David, today we have on Mark Keiser from Viceroy. Mark is the president of development, where he leads the global growth and brand expansion. Viceroy is known for its collection of luxury lifestyle hotels that combine bold design, inspiring settings, and authentic local experiences. With more than 25 years of hospitality, Mark has guided the development of iconic brands across the industry and now oversees Viceroy's expanding portfolio worldwide. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you. I really appreciate both of you having me on.
All right, so Mark, we're going to go through a real quick lightning round, get you some questions in there, talk about your personal background, your career, and then jump into some industry topics. Sound good?
Sounds great.
All right, so what's something that you wish you were better at?
Oh, so many things. Something I wish I were better at. Skiing, for one.
All right, what's a luxury you can't live without?
That's a great question. A great steak.
Okay,
Nice.
that's a good answer. So if you had a time machine and you could go into the future or go back into the past, which way are you going and what year would you go to?
Great question. Wow. You know, you think you can prepare for these things, and then that comes out of here. I've been, I've got an 8-year-old daughter, and so there's a lot of like history type you know, questions that come up in our household, and I think that leads me towards going back into the past, and you know, I would have to go to like the revolutionary period in the U.S., and I think how incredible for people to come across essentially the world and create a new country. And now we're so fortunate, to be able to go to all the monuments and buildings and, and learn everything that happened. And so that's what I would do. I don't know if it was 1776 or, a couple decades before, but, the revolutionary period.
Okay, great. What is your favorite city and why?
I have to say New York. I mean, it's home. And, it's one of those places where I never thought I'd be here for 20 plus years, but it's really hard to leave, in terms of relocating. It's probably one of the most oppressive places in the country if you can't leave, but fortunately with a job and travel, I'm on the road quite a bit and coming back to New York, always energizes me.
Love
That
that.
makes sense.
Love that.
Love it.
So, Mark, now we're going to dive into your personal background, kind of what makes you tick a little bit. So, you grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. Is that
I
correct?
did. I did.
How did growing up in Baltimore shape you into who you are today?
I grew up in, a pretty innocent suburban setting, walked to elementary school, took a bus to middle school and high school until driving started. And I'm not sure. I mean, great sense of values, community. It was an innocent, upbringing. We, you know, drove cross country to Mount Rushmore, or we'd go to the beach, but we weren't flying out west for skiing and traveling across Europe and all these things as a kid. But what did have a big impact was in my sophomore year of high school, my father took a job in Puerto Rico, working for the university, well, working for a software technology company that was automating the university's otherwise manual functions. So
Wow.
admissions, course enrollment, all those things. And so he was down there for about 2 years and would travel home every other week. And we had the privilege of going down a few times, and we'd often stay in nice hotels. So El
Nice.
San Juan, the Condado Plaza. He lived at one point at Palmas del Mar, and I just got the bug of like didn't know these places existed and didn't know that you could have a career working in the hotel industry. And so that had a big impact on sort of my interest, in the hospitality field.
Nice.
Yeah, so maybe elaborate on that a little bit more. So you went to Cornell's hotel school. That's where you got your degree. How did you know what was really what when you got interested in hospitality? What drove you to end up going to Cornell and really, study?
So both my parents went to Cornell, neither in the hotel school. My mom was human ecology, and my dad was ag ec. And so I knew about it. I'd been there for a reunion at some point during my childhood. And the fact that Cornell had, the preeminent hotel school was sort of the draw. I was familiar with the university and knew, you know, Ivy League, obviously. Um, my parents were pretty discouraging of the idea. My mom was very much a believer that I should go to a school like Duke, get an economics major. If I want to be in the hotel business, you can always decide to do that, but why start so specialized? And, it turned out okay. But what I found out a few years, into Cornell is, or at least reflecting back on it, is I equate it similar to learning a language. Once you learn a second language, learning a third or a fourth is a lot easier than learning that second language. And there's such a focus when you're at Cornell on learning the hotel business that if you decide that you want to go into some other business, you've learned one in detail,
Right.
or at least as much as you can as a college student, but you've learned how to learn about a business or an industry. And so I think that is actually a really interesting way, to think about going into what otherwise might be a really hyper specialized field so early on, you know, as an academic career.
Sure,
Makes
sure.
sense.
I understand you got really excited about hospitality as a career being a foreign exchange student.
That's
Uh, that's true. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like, what about being a foreign exchange student got you so excited about hospitality?
So I talked my parents into letting me go to France my junior year of high school. And it's obviously a little unusual because most people, if they go away for a year, they do it during college. And it's complicated as a high school student because you don't want to miss a year. I certainly didn't. But I found a program called School Year Abroad where they bring over a math and English teacher. So you stay on schedule for graduation. You have to take, maybe an extra history class because at least at the time you needed 4 years of history, but you can otherwise graduate on time. And so we were given the ability to travel outside of school hours, so if weekends or, France has plenty of holidays. And with permission from your parents, you could go off and take a train to wherever. And, that was not glamorous, accommodations, but you know, how great to be. I was 16 turning 17 at the time and, with friends who are also learning, French at the same time. Everybody had some different level of experience with the language or proficiency in the language. And I just found it amazing and liberating and like to see, in this case, a very small part of the world. I think I just went to France and Spain, during that year, and maybe Switzerland, but that cemented, my interest in the hotel business.
That's great. That's a good story. I can't imagine traveling abroad at 16, but very cool. Very cool. So now we're going to dive into your career a little bit, how you became the president of development at Viceroy. So earlier in your career, you were at Prime Hospitality and Wyndham.
Yeah.
And I understand at Wyndham, you were challenged by your boss or manager to be the GM of three hotels in Austin. You explained this experience as some place where you were making all the mistakes as you possibly could.
Hmm.
Can you tell us more about the background, that experience, and what you learned being the GM of those 3 hotels in Austin?
Yeah, so I got hired out of school to go to Wyndham. They were launching a hotel brand called Homegate Studios and Suites. It was still in the infancy of extended stay hotels, and they needed somebody to help the president of the brand. And to your point, Troy Pentecost challenged me. You came from Cornell, you're a smart kid, never worked a hard day in your life, blah, blah, blah. It's 20 years ago, so if I'm off a little bit on the paraphrasing, forgive me, Troy, but along those lines. And I called his bluff and I said, well, there's one under construction here in Dallas. Why don't you let me run it? And, ultimately he took the challenge and, or took the bait. And while that hotel was under construction, Prime Hospitality came along and bought the real estate holding company of Homegate and paid Wyndham a fee to go away as the operator. They wanted to own and operate them themselves. And they asked if anybody was interested in joining. Within Wyndham, I had some options, but with Prime, I told them that I was slated to be the general manager of this hotel under construction. And they said, well, how about this? Help the new incoming president for 6 months or so, help open a few hotels that are under construction, and pick a market where if you're good at it, then you'd have a multi-property opportunity. And those two markets were Indianapolis and Austin. And so having gone to Cornell, I chose Austin. I don't think you have to go too far to make that choice at 20 odd years old. So I opened a newly constructed hotel in Austin. And yeah, I hired the whole team. Most of those people were the wrong people, as it turns out. And I think there was an assumption that I knew a lot more. No one had asked if I'd ever worked in a hotel before. The answer to that would have been as a bellman one summer in Myrtle Beach. And so, nonetheless, the team that supports openings there, expected that I'd worked my way up in some capacity into a GM role and knew things that I didn't. And so that, clearly contributed to mistakes. But super proud after, a year and a half or so, we were in great financial shape. We were always like really strong on the revenue side because the market was on fire, but no turnover for the last 6 months, and they offered me a role to run the other three properties in the market. I didn't accept that. I went back to Wyndham and took a job in corporate finance and was super happy. I always wanted to have operations experience. I felt
Mhm.
like that was super interesting. At some point, I always thought I wanted to be a general manager, but I decided I wanted to be more on the business side. And that like year and a half of intensive operations experience at a very small level, was formative.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then your career, you moved into leadership roles into the development side of things with Starwood, SH Hotels, EOS. What kind of led you? What made you passionate about getting involved in that side of the business?
It was really a gentleman named Jerry Thaley, who unfortunately is no longer with us, but he was head of the luxury brands within Wyndham. And, for the audience, this was Wyndham that was spun out of Trammell Crow, different from the Wyndham that Sendin bought and then renamed their company. So it was hotels like the Anatole in Dallas, but in Arizona, there were the Boulders and a few other properties. Then in Puerto Rico, they had an extensive portfolio. Remarkably, Condado Plaza and El San Juan hotels that I stayed at in high school were part of Wyndham at the time. And Jerry was responsible for growing, fixing, asset managing the luxury portfolio. And I was moonlighting with him from my job in corporate treasury. I'd asked my boss at the time, Judy Hendrick, to let me experience some other departments outside of corporate finance, and she was super supportive of that. And so I found myself working with Jerry, who brought me to every meeting, gave me a front row seat for how he negotiated. He ultimately, a few years later, when I was thinking about leaving Bear Stearns and wanted to move to Starwood Hotels, he was then working for one of our Puerto Rican partners, and was a big supporter of my candidacy for the job at Starwood. And ultimately, we did a couple deals with him and his Puerto Rican partners early in my Starwood Hotel days. So he was very influential in early, and then maybe a few years into my career on the business development side.
That's awesome. So, our next question is a two-part question for you. So, you're now the president of development at Viceroy, where you're spearheading Viceroy's growth strategy. When you're looking at new hotels that could potentially fit within Viceroy, are there any criteria of those hotels that are essential to align with the Viceroy brand? And then, as far as a growth strategy goes, what's next, or what's your current growth strategy look like?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So, to your first point of like, what are the characteristics of a Viceroy hotel? We want to be competitive in the market with other luxury products. We sometimes say luxury lifestyle. We're deliberately positioned below ultra luxury, and we want to be something a little more youthful, a little bit more fun than more traditional luxury. And so, urban versus resort varies. We're not going to mandate a spa in an urban property if we don't think that there's business to support it or that it is necessary to be competitive on the room product side of the business. A great food and beverage experience is so important today, but we can have more modest F&B operations, a single bar and a single restaurant, or we can do more robust with multiple venues and a rooftop. We really don't want to over program the hotels, but we also want to generate, highly profitable hotels for our owners. On the resort side, it varies. One of the things when Highgate bought Viceroy is that the portfolio was pretty diverse. The Riviera Maya property is 40 individual villas, and then you contrast that with Cabo, which is this architectural, very modern expression, and you know 190 rooms of hotel condos and fractional units that all go into a rental program. Sugar Beach is more appropriate from a look and feel to a Caribbean island and sitting in a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It sort of goes on and on. So as we were thinking about the future of the brand, we weren't going to use as a hallmark of the brand some level of consistency of look and feel, or that every property has the same amenity package. We really, you know, looking at what the portfolio was, had to design, the future of the brand around that reality, which is so appropriate for what customers want today in our view. Like they want to have a Riviera Maya type experience there and a very different experience in Snowmass or in Portugal. Probably the one that is gaining the most attention, and certainly one that's near and dear to my heart, is Sun Valley. This is a property that is, call it 75 rooms with a dozen residences, some of which will go back into a rental program in the heart of Ketchum, a mile from the lift taking up to the mountain. And Sun Valley, for those that don't know, is a, generally a very affluent community, cosmopolitan, once great retail, food and beverage, wellness offerings, and hasn't had a luxury hotel despite the profile and affluence of many of the homeowners there and visitors. And so we feel incredibly fortunate to be involved and to be able to deliver what we think the market has been wanting, not so large that it attracts a customer that's going to disrupt the fabric of what Sun Valley is, but large enough to have, to be a social hub, for the community as well as for our guests. And so that's super exciting. We've leaned in pretty heavily on standalone branded residences, which is a validation of the brand, that people want to live in a building where the brand comes to life, not just through sort of the sign on the door, but really the experiences and activations that we're bringing to these properties. Viceroy has been fortunate to have been in the residential building business since, let's call it 2007, when the sales for Viceroy Snowmass first started, maybe a year before, but roughly that time. So call it 20 years. And we've seen really strong interest from very established partners, development partners in South Florida, in Mexico, in the Caribbean. And one of the components of why we love that business is that these owners become very loyal guests. And if you choose to buy an a Viceroy, and immediately upon, signing the purchase contract, you become a top tier client of a Viceroy with all of the VVIP perks that you would as though you traveled 100 nights a year at a Viceroy hotel or whatever it may be. So we're seeing great engagement from the buyer community, which we love.
So for those who are watching or listening, we've talked about, and you've said, lifestyle, luxury. It maybe explain a little bit more in depth what is the Viceroy brand and
Sure.
what best way to represent that.
Yeah. So as we look at the landscape of luxury hotels or luxury lifestyle hotels, however you want to categorize the positioning for Viceroy, what we see is a lot of brands talk about experiences as something that their guests are interested in doing. Yet we saw an opportunity to really do it right and to own that piece of the industry space. And what I mean by that is we believe that today's customer, no longer, wants to sit by a pool or play golf in a gated community in a far flung location. That's available locally, it's available domestically. And when travelers are looking to go to Italy or Portugal or Tokyo, that they really want to come back with a knowledge and memories that were created of doing something that enabled them to understand the culture, differently than they could have if they traveled domestically or stayed at home. And so what we saw is that sometimes there'd be an experience like a tequila tasting at a Mexican property in a more traditional luxury brand. And they would guide you through an experience of perhaps how to detect certain notes within the tequilas, but the tequila offerings in front of you would be bottles that you could buy in New York or LA or wherever you are. For us, it's really about bringing in local purveyors, local artisans, giving you access to bottles that you can't buy readily in the US. You might have to carry back, while also giving the education of how tequila is made or what region of Mexico it comes from and all of those components. And what we've done, in order to do that is we've really engaged with our team members to ask them what they think we should show off in their town. And so our newly opened property in Portugal in the Algarve called Viceroy Umbria, one of the front desk associates said, "Well, do you think anybody would want to go to my family's like honey farm, like beekeeping business?" And we're like, "That sounds pretty awesome." And so now our guests get like fully suited up in beekeeper
Wow.
gear, go in, bees, thousand bees swarming around, and that's such a different experience than when you're having breakfast and the waiter or waitress says, "Oh, just so you know, the honey in your jar right there came from some bees on the roof." Like, right? Like, we want you to really experience it. And whether you go home with a little jar of honey that you helped create, like, is irrelevant, right? Like, you tell that story for years. And your kids tell that story for years. And that's really the emotional connection that we want to establish with our guests.
That's incredible. Well said. So now we're going to dive into the thought leadership, kind of what's happening and what you're seeing in the industry right now. So, one of the segments I feel that's changing the most is the luxury segment. It is evolving, I guess, not, I don't know, more quickly than other segments, but definitely is on evolving more. What do you, I guess, define and what do you think of the luxury space evolving? Anything you're seeing?
I mean, it is, to your point, Steve, it's a space where the spending has accelerated,
Yeah.
and not just in room rates, where I think all of us have experienced a sticker shock of where we want to go, where we want to stay, and what that costs today. But beyond the room rate, we find that the luxury consumer is very prone to spending for experiences, spending for food and wine and all the components. and what things that are unique and different. We see a tightening of the belt within the core of the industry, whether it's upscale, certainly as you go down into the economy segments, and there's you know almost no upper limit on the luxury side. We opened a mega villa, if that's a term, in St. Lucia. The owners of the resort built a home for their personal use, and have offered it, to rent, during periods when they're not there. And you can rent it as either 5, 7, or 9 bedrooms. It sits on the ocean. It's full of their personal collection of art, and you can rent that and experience that for, let's call it 60 to 70,000 a night. And clearly they don't want just anybody staying there, because they did put priceless, nearly priceless works of art into the residence. But that's a very specific customer who travels with a big enough group to want, you know, let's call it 9 bedrooms, but also, has that sort of disposable income. And we have bookings, for festive. We have bookings, through all of first quarter for that for that residence, and that shows, you know, one of the areas where, and that customer doesn't want to sit in the villa all day, right? So that's where we find it such an interesting component or segment in the business today.
Interesting.
And as you look and you see some of the trends that are taking place, how is Viceroy really capitalizing with them on property?
And it starts before the stay.
Right.
To be fair, David, that communication in advance is critical, because we have such enormous resources at our hotels. Everybody does. It's how you harness them. Whether it's associates that their families have businesses, associates that work in other businesses, they know, the locales, better than we do, even though we're running the hotels. And so it's really getting to know your guests and getting to know what they want to do, and then providing a customized experience as best you can. And I say that as best you can is you want to have some consistency, to your offering. And we're not a private home, but to the extent that somebody wants a certain experience, others may also. And if we can turn that into an offering for our guests. But I think it really starts, you know, if it's a first time guest at the hotel or first time customer within the Viceroy system, is communicating with them pre-arrival.
That's great. So, Mark, specifically in the luxury space, where are you seeing the most opportunity for growth right now, or even to create more revenue?
So geographically, the emerging markets are, super dynamic. And, I look to the Middle East, whether it's Dubai and Saudi, I look to Asia, the quality of product that's being built, the money inflows into those economies. It's just at a pace that's so different than what we're seeing in the US or Europe or South America today. And it's super exciting. And, there's not just the physical buildings that are being built, but also, the workforce that is engaged, and, the level of energy and optimism when you go into Dubai, for example, is so different than many of the places where I travel in the US, where there's uncertainty. And, and in Dubai, it's like everything is going up, and and people's personal income is going up. And if they were fortunate to have bought a starter apartment, then that's now worth multiples of what they paid for it, and they've moved into the next apartment, and we're trying to capitalize on that.
So, is there any lessons or advice that you've received from either, someone you considered a mentor, someone you worked with that you carry with you today and try to make sure that you always remember that?
Yeah, there's probably a couple things. So, first and foremost, I think I was pushed early in my career, to take sort of step up roles that I didn't necessarily have the experience for, but I had the desire. And doing that early in your career is possible, and doing that later in your career is probably may not end as well. right? Like, there's a lot of things you should not consider hiring me to be responsible for today, but early on, like, you know, playing a role in different groups was very helpful. That, and then I think the other piece is just, being available, to people who are earlier in their career and letting people tag along, right? Like you don't need to create a whole program for somebody, but letting them be on calls that they're interested in being on, introducing them as somebody who's going to listen in and learn. And, I've never found any resistance, to that within, people who I've been speaking with. And I think it provides an opportunity, for people who are younger in their careers to figure out what they want to do. And so those are probably the two things I'd share.
That's good
That's
advice.
great. Well said, Mark. Well said. So, Mark, we've been asking you questions this whole time, right? So now we're going to turn the tables and let you ask David and I a question.
Sounds great. So please send the name of 5 to 7 owners that are looking for a brand like Viceroy. Um,
Yeah.
hey,
Done.
that's your homework. No, but I appreciate both of your time. I love to hear where people are, like where they love to travel to, and I'd love it doesn't have to be one place. It could be a couple top places if that's easier for each of you.
All right. I mean, I don't think it's a secret to anybody who listens to podcasts. I love like outdoor. I love being outdoors. I love kind of the experience, travel and stuff like that. So I love going into the mountains. I love going to small mountain towns where sometimes the cell service might not work well, but I really enjoy just kind of getting off the grid and going places where, it's a little bit I come from a small town in Wisconsin, so I enjoy being in those small, specifically mountain towns or almost country western towns as well. So those are the places that I really love to kind of travel to the most. Kind of those maybe those second tier, third tier, even fourth tier cities. So not a big city guy anymore, but yeah, that's just me. David, what about you?
Yeah, no, I think for me, a little bit opposite, but I mean, I love the cities. I think from, just growing up in the suburbs and then, working in New York, I kind of always have this interest of how does the city compare to New York and what's it going to be like. So, for me, it's really more about the people I'm with. And if I can get somebody local, whether it's a big city or an off the beaten path, smaller town, to me, it's who's that I've just learned over the years that whoever that person is that is helping you plan your accommodations or pick the restaurant, if they're local, that just brings this whole nother it's like sunscreen. You don't have to worry about getting burnt. You know someone's gonna take care of you. So that's what I would say.
I love that expression. Steve, for you, Highgate recently made an investment in a company called Conservatory Collective.
Okay.
And there's a collection of almost 70 properties that are generally luxury, although luxury could be Catskills luxury, or
Sure.
it could be, African safari luxury, and everything from Antarctica to British Columbia fishing to a chalet on Denali in Alaska. So there's some mountain properties in there for you, David. They skew more far flung than urban, so you're gonna have to stick to some of our Viceroy hotels. But
You guys have the Viceroy Snowmass here in Colorado, so that is one on my bucket list I gotta check out. It's in the mountains, it looks beautiful, so that one's on my bucket list. So, we'll get a Viceroy property in there, don't worry about that.
yeah, and one of the cool things that we did last year for an industry group was we hosted lunch on the mountain, and typically this group would eat at the cafeteria at the top of the mountain. Everyone scrambled for chairs, and instead we were just at the side of a cliff, with great catered food from Viceroy, of course, and some drinks and just bluebird skies above. It was amazing.
Incredible, incredible. So, Mark, our producer, John, he's been listening this whole time. He has one final question for you here before we get you out of here.
One thing you said early on was that you landed that first GM job without, without any hospitality or hotel experience besides that short stint as a bellman. And so if you could take yourself back to those days and put yourself in somebody's shoes who's maybe in that position, what would be like one or two things that you wish somebody had told you or that you knew at that moment? And it's probably a lot of things you just didn't know that you didn't know, right?
Yeah.
But I'm curious if there's any like, big things that come to mind.
To be fair, prior to being the GM, I was helping the existing GMs figure out like this business model, which was a
All right. Yeah.
hybrid of like a Wyndham Garden hotel and an apartment. So, while I had never been behind the front desk or
Yeah. So
helping
maybe
at a hotel,
on property.
yeah, I'd never been on property.
Yeah.
But you know, I like to tell John a kind of a funny story, which is when the auditors came to conduct, a fairly standard audit of the operations of my hotel. And my direct supervisor had not stepped foot in my hotel in the first 8 months that the hotel had opened. He sort of purposely left me alone, but also he had a lot of problems in the rest of the portfolio. When he got home to Austin, he just would go home and spend time with his family. But he also thought it'd be interesting to see what would happen. And so when the auditors come to your hotel, they immediately ask the front desk agents to let them count their drawers, right? And so let's say there's supposed to be $300. They count each of the drawers. There's $300 in each of the drawers. Check. Then they asked me to open up the safe in my office, and there's, let's say, supposed to be $500 in there, and there was like $21. And the guy's like, "Where's the rest of the money?" And I'm like, "I'm so glad you're here. Like, I've been sending these receipts back to corporate, and they're not like sending me the money." And he looked at me like, he didn't know how to react because like 101 apparently is that you deposit short of whatever cash you needed to use during the course of the day so that the safe always has $500. You never send receipts back to the corporate office. Like anybody who's ever like been a front office manager knows this. Probably half the front desk agents know this, and I had no idea. And it is an enormous red flag when you don't have the cash
Right.
on
Yep.
property that you're supposed to have. So, that I think encapsulates all the stuff that I didn't know that I didn't know. But what I would, probably have done if I could go back in time was let me shadow an existing general manager for 10 days. Probably could have been a lot longer, but like just as a minimum, like go somewhere for 10 days and just live the life of whatever they do, and then go to your own hotel. But I just think it's probably like better advised to like have some other job in a hotel before you're in charge of the thing.
That's funny. All right. Well, that does it for another episode of The Modern Hotelier, the most engaged podcast in hospitality. So whether you're watching or listening, we appreciate you and hope to be with you again soon. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Thank you. Really appreciate you including me. And I'm a big fan of your show, and congratulations on all your success.
You made it to the end of The Modern Hotelier. Thanks for watching or listening. The Modern Hotelier is produced by Modern Hotelier Media. Make sure to like and subscribe if you're listening on YouTube, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you know a good guest, sponsor, or have media needs, feel free to reach out to us at hello@themodernhotelier.com. Thanks and have a great day.